more into
Okay. I wanted to make a separate recording from the SIP meeting.
Cool. I'm just gonna quickly pin them, but I think most of the people are here. Hey, Rafael.
Good morning, Hero. How are you?
Yeah, good. How are you?
All good, thank you.
Yeah, very good SBTC session. Yeah, I didn't know SBTC was gonna be on the mainnet already pretty soon, so I'm excited to hear, to see how people use it. To be honest, I know it'll be limited, but yeah, that was the gist of the goal and all the engineering work going into it. So yeah, so why don't we start? So thanks everybody for coming again to SIP Editors in between bi-weekly thing. Yeah, just trying to get more knowledge into, you know, including myself. I don't know everything, and just trying to leverage some of the really smart people who's already done the SIPs, gone through the whole SIP process, and what learning we can take from here, like Rafael and other people, and trying to share it with all the people in the SIP editors. So in the future, like, you can take this and go and share with other SIP editors to be in the future. So really sort of upscaling everybody, and just good to know how to go through something, so we can appreciate how a SIP author from SIP author's perspective, and therefore support the SIP author go through the process. And also we need to understand how to review their SIPs, their proposal, as a group and as an individual, because at the end of the day, I think the goal would be to make sure that most people, at least maybe all the people on the SIP editors committee, are able to independently vet a SIP. Now, I do understand, like, a lot of the time when you're vetting SIPs, you are not just in isolation. You will ask other people for feedback, but at least, you know, whether you're a SIP editor, I think to see a complete independent vetting by one person on just one SIP, I think I haven't seen that yet. I don't know, maybe Rafael, if you can verify that, but I think sometimes we need to ask other experts to chime in, maybe, in order to form your judgment about a specific topic or discussion. So that's what I'm seeing sort of on the GitHub itself. So, but at least if we work towards the final goal of being able to vet as much as possible by a SIP editor independently, and we have the opportunities of bi-weekly to talk among us as well, I think all this sort of facilitate towards a really holistic approach. That's the goal I'm trying to achieve for everybody in this group. Yeah, I don't know if Jenny got any comments about that.
No, I think you covered it really well. Thank you, Hero.
Cool. Why don't we start?
Sure. Let's see. Let me share my screen. Hold on. Are we recording this, Hero, already?
Yeah, already. Yeah.
Yes, recording.
Perfect. All right. So thanks everybody for coming. This will be a brief SIP editors workshop. I don't expect we'll take the whole hour, but it would be great if at the end of the presentation we have some discussion topics between us. But the main goal of this workshop is to first go over basically what a SIP editor is, just to do a quick recap, and then review the responsibilities and duties that we as SIP editors have towards the complete review process, and what is our the tasks that we need to accomplish when a new SIP is proposed, and how we can help bootstrap the process and also encourage the community to contribute more towards the development of the Stacks ecosystem. So the agenda is very basic. We'll see first what are the different SIP editor duties that we have. We'll review the workflow of a SIP just to make sure that we know where our duties lie inside of the entire workflow. And then we'll review a draft SIP, and we'll actually take a look at SIP 0 to see all of the different things that we need to check when a new SIP is proposed. And we'll go through some examples. And at the end, we'll just have a discussion or any questions or anything that we might be able to talk about. So please, if there are any questions along the way, let me know. I can't see the chat because I'm in a full screen presentation, but just interrupt me whenever you want. That's totally fine. All right. So first, what are our duties as SIP editors? And it's actually very simple. A SIP editor basically maintains the funnel for SIPs, the inbound funnel, which means all the SIPs that come, that are new, that are proposed from the Stacks community, we maintain that funnel. And next, we make sure that all of these inbound SIPs are well formed, they are relevant, and they don't duplicate prior work. And this can also include prior SIPs that have been rejected. So basically, we have to make sure that whatever is being proposed is a new idea that hasn't been discussed yet by the community. So basically, these are the two duties that we have. But of course, each one of these two duties has a lot of different responsibilities. So I'm going to go over the most important ones, not all of them. And first, the most important responsibility that we have is to get users started with a SIP process. And what does this mean? This is very simple. It basically means that we should encourage users to submit SIPs if they have good ideas that could be worth implementing on the Stacks ecosystem. And as we will see a little bit later, these ideas are not necessarily technical ideas. They might be ideas about collaboration, communication, inclusion, and a whole lot of different aspects that a SIP can cover. But basically, our goal is to make sure that the community feels empowered enough to be able to submit SIP ideas, even though they are drafts and they're not very well formed. It's actually also our responsibility to make sure that they have a good form so that they can be evaluated by the advisory boards later on. Next, feedback. And this is actually the most, the lengthiest part of what we do, because this is when we provide actual feedback of a SIP that already has been submitted as a pull request into the SIP's GitHub repository. So basically, during feedback, we make sure that the SIP is well formed according to SIP 0, and this is something that we will dive in a couple of minutes, because this is obviously very important. We also have to make sure that the SIP has not been proposed before. So again, as I mentioned earlier, that it's a new idea. We also can have to make sure, to the best of our ability, that the SIP is original work, meaning that the author has not copied that work from anybody else or anywhere else. And lastly, we have to make sure that the zip is appropriate for its type and consideration. And also type and consideration, we're going to see these two concepts a little bit later, but basically it just means that we need to make sure that the zip is correctly classified on what the scope of the changes could be. We also have to recommend additional considerations if they are appropriate. We have to make sure that the text is clear, that it's concise, that it's correct English. So basically provide some proofreading, make sure formatting is correct, and a few other things that I will exemplify in a couple of minutes. And we have to make sure that there are appropriate avenues for discussion of the SIP. And these can also be listed in the preamble of the SIP. These discussions commonly take place on the same GitHub pull request, but there could also be discussions in the forum, as it usually happens, mailing lists, or any other medium that the author can choose. Next, acceptance. And this means we as editors take SIPs that are drafts, and our goal is to get them to be accepted. This means that we are the ones who assign the number of the SIP. So we have to make sure that authors, even though they could prefer a SIP number when they submit their idea, we are the ones that actually assign this number, and we take the smallest positive number that is not currently used to identify any other SIP that has been ratified or any other SIP that is currently accepted, right? So it's basically trying to keep numbers as low as possible, but not to collide with any other SIP that is actually active. And then, excuse me, we have to set the status to accepted. And this is when we actually pass the SIP from the editing phase to the next phase, which is handled by the consideration advisory boards. And we'll get to that in the next couple of slides. So what is the workflow? And this is when, this is very important, I think, because it also helps us to know what our work is with regards to the entire workflow and what actually the scope of our work is, because it could be very easy for us to receive a SIP and then right off the bat provide, for example, technical feedback if it's a technical SIP, but that's not really our responsibility. I mean, I guess that we could do that further along the workflow, but as SIP editors, what we need to do is just make sure that the SIP makes sense, that it conforms to SIP 0, and that the formatting is correct, English is correct, as I mentioned in a couple slides ago. So how does this look like in the entire workflow? This is a workflow that I took from SIP 0. Actually, Hero presents this diagram pretty often, which is great. So basically, we take, and I actually put up a square here. We take a SIP when it is a draft, and then we as SIP editors, our goal is to either accept the SIP after providing feedback and having that feedback be addressed, or rejecting a SIP that they can then revise and resubmit, and we can do this loop as many times as necessary. So this is basically the entire scope of our work. Once the SIP is accepted, it goes to the consideration advisory boards, which are composed of different people, depending on if it's a technical SIP or SIPs that have other considerations. So basically, there are teams that would review each one of these different SIPs, and our goal is only to hand off the newly accepted SIP that has a new number to one of these boards for formal review, and they can then provide their own feedback, but that feedback would be entirely on the contents of the SIP, not the formatting of the SIP, which is something that at this point should be finalized. Right, so next, I want to show you SIP 0, and then we can do a few examples just to look at historical SIPs, like in the past, what is the kind of feedback that they received, what kind of result you should look for, the different aspects that it should have. So any questions so far? Let me see the chat. Well, I can actually see the chat. So there doesn't seem to be any questions. I don't know if anybody wants to talk at this point. Feel free to do so. So, oh, sorry.
I think it's just a very minor point. I think we just need to figure out how we as a group turn the draft into accepted, whether one person would does it independently or would it be a group decision, and how we come to that group decision. I don't think we need to figure that out right now, but there's just a point to put on everybody's radar.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's actually described here in SIP 0. So I think a good idea would be to quickly review this SIP, and let me know if the text size is not very good, but I think we can make it a bit larger. There we go. Right, so SIP 0 is basically your playbook as a SIP editor, and it's actually very straightforward to review a SIP because here, I mean, all of the different aspects that you have to look for are described here in very good detail. So I encourage you to read SIP 0 entirely. It's actually a very quick read, and it's very informative because it gives you basically an overview of the stacks improvement proposal, like as a whole, and what's the goal, you know, what kind of the process that I just described briefly. You can see here basically the background, why does this process exist? And this is very important. I will not go into this right now, but again, I encourage you to read this if you want to continue being a SIP editor and do this, you know, for a long time. This is something that you absolutely should know. But this is where our work comes in on the specification part. So basically, the goal of our review is to make sure that the format of the SIP conforms to this format that is described down here. So you'll see that, first of all, a SIP has to contain a few sections, and this is absolutely necessary. So for example, the preamble, and that has a lot of different fields. For example, the SIP number, the title of the SIP, of course, the author or authors, consideration, which is basically what type of SIP this is. And below, you'll see some examples of considerations. Let me try to find this. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. There are different SIP types. So, for example, a consensus SIP, which is one that changes the stack's blockchain implementation and could result in a soft fork or hard fork. So, for example, SIP 15, if we go to SIPs, SIP 15, which introduced stacks 2.1. So it is of type consensus, which is pretty obvious, right? Because it created a hard fork. And as you can see, this is a preamble of the SIP number, the title, the authors, long list, a consideration, in this case, that it's a technical consideration. So if we go back to the format in the preamble, the consideration, right? And then the types. So let me see if I can find another example. Well, let's just go back to here. Okay. And then the status, in this case, it's already ratified, but when we receive a SIP, it will be draft. And remember the workflow. When it was created, the license, it has to have a license. This is very important. And then who is going to sign off? This part can be filled in a little bit later in the process because that's when the consideration advisory boards get involved. And as you can see, this has also a link to the discussions, like where could users find or readers find discussions for the SIP, right? And some other additional fields, like for example, if it's like related to trades, applications, API, RPC, etc. All of this you can find here in great detail. But this is the most important part. Basically, a SIP has to have these different sections. First, it has an abstract, which gives you a summary of the SIP, like why the SIP exists, what is the goal, and what is it proposing in very, very concise terms. So as you can see, in this example of SIP 15, it proposes changes to stacking, to clarity, and block validation. So basically stacks 2.1. And it also specifies that there has to be a vote from stakeholders in order to activate the SIP. So basically it just provides a summary of the SIP. So you have to be very careful that the SIP that is being submitted actually has a very clear description on here. So just to make a small parenthesis, it's basically like if you were reviewing a paper from somebody, right? Like in school, like an essay or some sort, basically just making sure that the essay or the SIP in this case follows a common structure and that the contents make sense and that they are understandable, not necessarily that they are valid or important or whatever that's going to be determined by the cabs, right? But you just have to make sure that it conforms to this structure. So next, it's the copyright phase. This could be included here, not necessarily. Some SIPs don't include it because they've already mentioned the license up here. But then the introduction, this is when the SIP actually provides like a summary of the problems that it is trying to solve. And this is when the authors should be very, very specific, right? Because they have to say, okay, why am I proposing this SIP? In this case, SIP 15 lines or describes the different problems with stacking, what it's trying to solve. Like, for example, stacking as proposed in SIP 7 has a design flaw, and it describes the flaw and all of the different things that it's trying to solve with this SIP, right? This is the introduction. It has to be as extensive as possible. You can look at other examples. For example, SIP 16, token metadata standard. The introduction is short because this SIP is actually very simple, but it does describe what problem it's trying to solve. And you can look at all the other ratified SIPs to have some more examples. Specification, this is when the actual SIP exists. Like, this is where you actually have to, as an author, you have to propose the changes and be as specific as possible. For example, in this case, since this is a technical SIP, it has to be very clear on what the technical changes should be. So, for example, you can obviously encourage the author to divide the specification by sort of big themes, in this case, stacking. It describes all of the different changes, the different periods of stacking, and then new methods that are included as clarity functions. So everything is here, you know, the changes. This SIP is actually very, very extensive, right? Changes to clarity, this is another subsection. And they also describe in great detail all the different methods, right, that are necessary for stacks 2.1. So I think this is pretty obvious. This is pretty clear. This is where the meat of the SIP should exist. And this is actually where most of the focus will be on the CAB review, right? Because they have to make sure that the contents and the specification that is being proposed makes sense, right? So you can actually look at all of these. I'm going to give you also another example. It's actually pretty long. Let's see. Right, okay. So SIP 19, the one that I authored, it has, actually, yeah, here we go. So in this case, the specification provides a standard for messages on the stacks chain. So you can see, for example, this is the payload that is proposed for FTs, for NFTs, for SFTs. So basically, this is where you have to be the as most or as specific as possible as authors. Okay, next, related work. This is also a very important section because this section has to summarize other solutions that could be considered as alternatives to this SIP. So you want to specify, or you want to encourage the author to specify different options for solving this problem and why they are not as appropriate as the one that is being proposed in this particular SIP. Okay. And then also backwards compatibility, if it applies. In this case, it specifies why or how Stacks 2.1 is backwards compatible. How is it not? Right? This is specified here. Activation, this is also very important because it gives the network an idea of when or which conditions have to be met for this SIP to be considered activated and ratified, right? So in this case of Stacks 2.1, this change was activated at a specific block height based on votes. So this is where it's specified. In the case of SIP 16 of token metadata, you can see the specification here. Activation, they say, okay, this SIP is activated if 10 contracts are deployed that follow this specification, which is also, I mean, it's just a condition specified by the SIP author. And then lastly, some reference implementations if they apply. So a reference implementation is basically an example implementation of the SIP in practice. So for example, for SIP 16, we'll see, in this case, they didn't provide one. Let me see if I can find, SIP 19 actually provides one. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. So in SIP 19 for notifications for token metadata updates, the reference implementation is it's a contract actually that says, hey, if you want to get an example on how you can emit these notifications, you can take a look at this contract that it's actually deployed to mainnet. And you can see the functions that it does. A lot of people are already using this contract, which is obviously a great sign for adoption. So yeah, this is just basically, sorry, when you, or how you provide examples for the community to follow when they want to adopt this SIP. Right, so that's it for the review. To summarize, you have to make sure that the SIP conforms to this format, and that it also has, you know, clear language. It's understandable. You can also look at some formatting. So I'm actually going to show you an example of our review that I recently did for Werner. I don't know if we have Werner on the call, but he submitted a great idea for the buy in USTX standard for non-custodial marketplace trades. We've discussed this SIP draft in past calls, which SIP 11, which is obviously to be defined, to be determined. But basically, you can look at this pull request. It's live on the SIPs repo. And you can see the review that I did last week, which is basically just looking at the different things that I identified in formatting of the document. So for example, you also have to take a look. Is it a markdown document? Because it has to be. Is it readable? Does it have, like, for example, doesn't exceed 100 characters per line? This is not like a very strict rule, but it's something that actually helps a lot for readability when you're consuming the document. And then making sure that for example, here on the preamble, all of the fields, are they correct? Are the headers specified correctly? Are the names of the sections correct? Are the links that are specified, are they live? Are they fresh? Do they work? You know, typos that you identified, those are also very important to fix, like document structure, like headers, subheaders, things like that. And you can also look, I mean, this is just one example of our review. You can, if you go to the pull requests of this repo, you'll see on the closed PRs, for example, let's see if we can find one for, yeah, for example, this one, SIP20, bitwise operations to Clarity 2. And you can see all the different comments from both the technical reviews and editor reviews. You can look at the file, right? So for example, look at this formatting. This is actually great formatting. It doesn't exceed 100 characters per line, so it's pretty easy to read. So all these different things you have to consider. So I'm going to pause there. I've been talking a lot. Are there any questions? Actually, we're pretty close to finishing. The next item is discussion. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or things that they would like to discuss at this point.
I don't have a question. Just want to say it's really good so far. Really amazing. Thank you for preparing this.
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, it's this would be a pretty short, pretty simple workshop. I mean, there's not too much content to see. It's basically just getting used to the SIP structure and format, doing your first review if you're a new editor. And by the way, you can also nominate other people. If you look at the, let's see, here we go. There's a subsection in SIP0 called SIP editor duties, which basically describes the content of the presentation that I just did. And one important part that we didn't discuss is recruitment. So you can actually recommend other users to become SIP editors. And this is, I think, a very good idea if we want to have a healthy SIP ecosystem. I mean, obviously, once the network grows more than it has, hopefully we'll start seeing a lot of new SIP drafts. So having just 2 or 3 SIP editors is not sustainable for that. So I also encourage you to recommend or ask anybody else who might be interested in this to be involved in the process. And they can obviously look at this recording if they want to have a brief introduction on their duties, responsibilities. So yeah, again, just as a conclusion, I encourage you to read SIP0, as I mentioned at the beginning. It's a very important document, very easy to read. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you for listening and your time. So we can move on to discussion. If there are any questions, any items that anybody wants to discuss.
So as a SIP editors, as a SIP proposer, do you foresee most of the people would just go to GitHub and start filling it out? Or do you think some people might prefer to fill it out via a form of some kind?
That's a good question. I think it would depend on the type of SIP, because for technical SIPs, I think users who propose technical SIPs are usually more on the engineering side. So they are more used to using GitHub and similar tools. So for them, it might be just simpler to submit the markdown document via a pull request, right? Even if it's just like a very draft idea. But for other SIPs that have other considerations, like community and things like that, a form or any other forum might be a good idea. It could probably begin as a discussion in the forum, and then it could become a SIP based on that. So that's also something to consider. But yeah, in conclusion, I mean, for me, I think it depends on the SIP type.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great point. Just going back to your recommendation for other SIP editors, so I would also encourage everybody to reach out to other people who might be interested in this effort, because it's part of what makes us more decentralized by having more distributed power or reviewer, so to speak. And and just to remind everybody, that's why I wanted to everybody to fill out the document I sent you guys. It's a Word document that has, I think everybody in this room basically maybe recommended by me or something. But yeah, if you just fill out the form, then we'll post all your names on GitHub. Make a quick announcement that you guys are the official SIP editors, at least for now, and start, so that would serve as a kickoff for the process in the future. And in the future, if you want to have to invite people, it will also be documented as on the GitHub. In the SIP 000 it's phrased as invite tree. So all that will be documented. But I don't think we need to share your emails out. I know, yeah, I think I don't think that's perhaps necessary, but it will probably go on GitHub.
Yeah, I think a GitHub account could be enough. Yeah, and for people who want to stay anonymous, they obviously can. So yeah, no problem with that, of course. Yeah. Hiro, can you repost the form on the chat?
Yeah. Yeah, Miss Fit, he's a community manager, I believe. He's not in our group, but he's very active sort of in the community, and I just invited him to this call, see if he's interested. Yeah, so I'll send him the form if he's interested, fill it out. Just give me a second.
I'd like to make a quick comment.
Sure.
Yeah.
So from what I'm understanding, us as SIP editors, we're basically formatting an idea to be presented for it to be evaluated by CAPS in the next stage. But where are these, these SIPs being originated in the first place? Can ourselves as SIP editors go into these forums and seek for ideas that have been discussed but abandoned, and then evaluate whether they would make a good SIP? Or are we looking for others to take on those discussions to a draft that we can format? I don't know if that made sense.
Sure, yeah. So I definitely think that we should encourage people to submit SIPs as one of the duties on the SIP editors. So yeah, for example, if you are reading the forum and there's an idea being discussed, you can most definitely encourage them to, hey, like it sounds like could be a very good improvement to the network. Why don't you draft a SIP, submit it, and then I can review it, for example, like I being you, Binaya, for example. It is not our responsibility to write the SIP for them. I mean, that's out of scope for what we do. We just want to make sure that they have the tools necessary for them to submit or write and submit their SIP. So for example, you can point them to SIP 0. That's pretty very useful. And so if they have questions about how to write the SIP structure, etc. And yeah, and then once it is submitted, you can then provide review for formatting and everything that we discussed.
Awesome. Another note, I agree with the fact that you mentioned it's important to have a vibrant a community of SIP editors that are circulating in and out. So we have like expanded base of pool of editors. What can be done or is being done currently in order to kind of expand that pool to incentivize more and more potential SIP editors to come in and contribute?
That's a good question. I don't know, Hero, if you want to.
Yeah, I think it's basically up to us now. We are the group who are leading this. Like you are the voice of the SIP editors now. How do you, you know, obviously I can have my own thoughts, but I don't want to dictate what we should do. But we are literally at the right beginning of the process of this sort of effort being born, and how we shape it in the future is really up to the group as a whole. So you are part of, like, I would ask you the question, how would you like to see this group grow? Yeah, my say is no, doesn't serve any more weight than you, and your ideas can help us grow. You know, like currently my original thought was to bring it at least to the public on a bi-weekly Twitter space. So at least it's more visible, because a lot of the SIP calls are sort of on Zoom because they need to be recorded. So getting out there on the Twitter space sphere, because that's where the most eyeballs are. And maybe they might see us on the Twitter space, they might jump in, they might ask questions, so to sort of attract people through Twitter space, maybe through Twitter posts, more about what Frau described today into simpler form, maybe making Twitter threads. I think all these can help. And if you have better ideas, maybe making videos, yeah, it's really like I would treat it as your almost like little business, or our business is everybody belongs to this effort, and your ideas as much or maybe better than mine.
Thank you for that comment, Hero. I think Rafael or Hero, it was you who mentioned the idea of some tree you mentioned, like a reputation tree or something like that. What was it, Hero?
It's just an invite tree.
Okay, invite tree.
It's just the way it was described in SIP 000. If you have other ideas who might, if you have recommendation, other people who you know might be interested or good at doing becoming a SIP editor, you can basically put the name down into the Word document I linked. Yeah, so put your name in there because you're basically a SIP editor already. So that, I think the first level, like we got a kickstart. So I recommended all you guys basically.
The reason, yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but the reason why I wanted to mention that is because I think for you know, users and you know, potential SIP editors to come and contribute initially when they join, it's, I think the first step is the kind of a difficult task to come and join and kind of understand the lay of the ground to understand the kind of work. So I think we can kind of leverage that invite tree. Is that on chain thing?
No, just on GitHub really. It's just a Word document. Think of it as a just I recommend you, you recommend somebody else. That's it.
Yeah, I get that, but I think if we can kind of you know, have some sort of metrics that will start to kind of keep track of that invite tree on chain, and then every time it kind of builds on that. So if we can have some sort of mechanism that kind of starts to keep track of the contribution as a SIP editor over time, I mean, we can discuss on the ways how to earn those invite, you know, things like that.
That's a great
We
idea.
can start to have some kind of on-chain metric that kind of shows, okay, you know, this editor has been contributing, and in this
Yeah, no, so it's a great topic because I actually talked about it with Ragnar on the Twitter space once. I actually would like everybody to have some sort of trackable reputation or on-chain system. Last I talked to Ragnar was like February or January or December, I can't remember. He said he won't launch his stuff till later, but like in April or something. So that is definitely like on the table. Like if we can work with people like his protocol and have a BNS everybody can have these on-chain contributions. You know, people like Marvin, like how do we backward assign his contribution and all this like Raphael's contribution plus the future contribution. I think it's a great topic so that over time we can see on-chain reputation, on-chain credibility of the important work this SIP editor community has to offer to the greater Stacks ecosystem, and it will only make every one of us be more credible and legitimate, and obviously probably good for your CV in some sense, you know. But yeah, I think that's where we would like to get to. But it's definitely a bigger topic that is not, we don't have the current capability. We have some sort of a way to get there. It's not very, it's probably a bit messy if we want to launch something like that now. But I think with Ragnar's reputational system, I think that can be a lot cleaner.
Okay, awesome.
What do you think?
I think this is a good conversation to continue to carry forward as more and more editors, and we get feedback from others, potential editors, to see if that's something moves the needle as to growing the pool of editors.
Yeah, we can invite Ragnar onto our bi-weekly Twitter space.
Yeah.
I believe BNS just started a working group. We can also jump in there, like raise our perspective to them too. But yeah, it's definitely a great, good point.
And is that something, is some topic like that, or is this SIP worthy? Because when I think of SIP, proposing something as a SIP, immediately I start thinking of technical and consensus level things, but there's other kinds of SIPs too, right? So whether something we just discussed is SIP worthy, and where in the spectrum would it fall if it were to be something considered?
I've been thinking about it a little bit recently about this kind of non-technical stuff. There are some details, like as a group of SIP editors, if we grow, like it hasn't specified exactly. For example, I don't know if Raphael spotted anything like how I know it says we just turn the draft into accepted, but it doesn't say how do we come to that consensus of whether any SIP will be turned into accepted, whether it's because, for example, right now we have 15 people or so. So do we all have to vote, and how that sort of vote would look like, and what sort of quorum would that look like? I'm not seeing that on the SIP 000 itself. I think if we get to a stage where something can be evergreen, have a sort of a method that hopefully evergreen, maybe we test it out first before we actually propose it. I can see something like that can be additional SIP to this SIP 000. Other type of non-technical SIP, I don't know yet, but I think if it's important enough, I think it can be.
Yeah, SIP 0 doesn't specify like a voting or anything for accepting a SIP. I think that is up to the individual editor who is reviewing the SIP. Because remember that accepted doesn't mean that the SIP will eventually be ratified. It just means that it conforms to the SIP structure and form that it has to have, right? So it's not a very heavy decision, so to speak. You just basically provide your stamp that says, okay, this SIP, it actually makes sense as a document, so let me pass this on to the CAB. But it doesn't mean, again, that SIP will eventually be accepted in the network, because the technical reviews or the CAB review is going to be the one who will determine that, actually. So it could very well be that you accept the SIP, and then in the next stage, it becomes rejected, right? So I think having the process just be individual, like an individual editor is the one who accepts the SIP, I think that is sufficient. That's, just my opinion. Otherwise, it becomes, I think, a bit bureaucratic.
Yeah, I can see it. What about any other type of SIP? Like back to Binaya's question, do you have any thoughts on like any other SIP that could become a SIP, but it's not technical?
Yeah, of course. Like for example, we had the discussion about the sorry, I forget the name, the code of conduct that
Yeah.
that didn't become a SIP in itself. But again, if it was proposed as a SIP, then the role of the editor would only be to look at the document and do the review that we went through today, not to determine if the SIP is worthwhile or valid or whatever. So in that case, it would have eventually become accepted, but then probably in the next phase, that's when the CAB would have some comments that might affect the SIP and could be rejected, could be moved forward. I mean, who knows, right? But obviously, in this example of the code of conduct, there was already a very heavy discussion in the whole community, so it didn't get to that point. I mean, it didn't become like a formal SIP draft or anything.
So are you leaning more towards the SIP editor do not exercise their opinion onto whether something should get through, as long as document it conforms with the format of the SIP documentation? Then
I believe so, yes. I mean, obviously, you can provide your opinion on the contents and what is being proposed as a, like a Stacks network participant, right? But as a SIP editor, that is out of scope. I guess that's my point.
Yeah. Jenny, do you have any thoughts on this specific topic?
Sorry, here, I did have to step away for a few minutes just before this, so I could use a recap.
But it's just we are reviewing, we're just asking the question whether SIP editors would sort of almost like be the sort of exercise their weigh in on whether something should or shouldn't be accepted. I think Raphael is more on the side of, and judging by the actual SIP 000 document, is that as long as the SIP, for example, code of conduct conforms with if in the world where code of conduct as was submitted and it conforms with the rules of all the formatting, like that can be accepted in theory, but do we as a SIP editors group not as like exercise any of our opinion onto the SIP proposal itself?
Okay, I did catch a little bit of this. And it's a good question. I think that, and I know some of it is up for interpretation based on SIP 000. It does feel like as much as possible, SIP editors should remain neutral. And for me, the baseline for that is just making sure that we're not saying like, I think this is a good SIP, or I think this is a bad SIP, or I think that the community should move forward with this, or I don't think the community should move forward with this. I think at the most, SIP editors can comment on the likelihood of an idea being pushed through based on the value that it delivers to the community and the impact that they think that it'll have, and also the timing, right? So I think it's totally okay for a SIP editor to say, this is an interesting idea and there's a lot of potential here. This might not be the right time for a SIP like this, considering the other priorities that we have. Here are some recommendations based on our experience that you can incorporate into your SIP to increase the likelihood of it being accepted. It's I know that's like very nuanced, but in that way, you're not saying like, you're not passing a value judgment on a SIP, but you're more sort of speaking on behalf of what you know the community wants and needs. Does that answer the question or add color?
Yeah, no, I think it's perfect. And I agree with that. Raphael?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think neutrality is a good word to summarize the SIP editing process, because it's just like making sure that the form is correct, not necessarily the contents are valid or valuable, right?
Yeah. And I guess like
Yeah.
because maybe SIP individual SIP proposer just has his perspective, but we as a SIP editor group, because we see everything in the ecosystem, so we have almost like a global context that we can offer that view to the SIP editor, and he or she can make her judgment.
Yeah. And to be clear, neutrality is not the same thing as being passive, right? So I think it's totally okay to say like, oh, I think this has a good chance of getting picked up by the community, as long as you can back that up and say like, from what we've seen, there's been a real need for this kind of SIP. That's okay, like that you can express your opinion there. And I think that that's the kind of expertise that we need at the SIP editor layer, because right now, like there is a vast landscape of lots of different ideas, and the challenge is prioritizing them. So having SIP editors who are really knowledgeable about the priorities and needs in the ecosystem is how we are able to filter out the best ideas. So don't think that being neutral means that you can't give any sort of opinion. It's more like value judgments and letting someone know that yes, this should get accepted, or no, it shouldn't get accepted, that we want to stay away from.
Cool, thank you so much. Any I see stack Bowtie Deployer and Miss Div, or any Estain. I know some of you might be new to this sort of group discussion about SIP editors. Do you guys have any, do you want to ask any question or any comments from you guys?
No. What I would say is that I think what we're lacking in terms of SAP editors is basically a proper guidebook, if we could put it that way, that maybe we could provide people with a sort of a guide, proper guide, and as the other guy said, that there should be some metrics to judge the performance, and the guidelines to how we operate, and what's in reach and what's outside our kind of reach, and what we can do in terms of helping the community and helping with SIPs. So I think there should be some kind of a proper guideline to help the SIP editors, so we can be more kind of productive. And also, when we're onboarding people, it's going to be much easier to tell them what they have to do, because somebody coming from outside the ecosystem, or maybe somebody new to the ecosystem, who's really trying to help, but doesn't have kind of those resources to help them understand what they have to do to help, is going to be a problem. So I'd say that we should really be working in that direction, and maybe building up a guidebook or a handbook for SIP editors.
I agree, and that's why I'm actually trying to currently have that handbook in that document, and you will see Jenny wrote a bit of a guide. I think we could help by adding in scope, out of scope stuff in there,
Awesome.
and he has also a list of SIPs. So that should be a good starting point to all of us, but everybody can contribute towards that, making it easier, or maybe you think something else would help, or maybe a website that we need. But yeah, that's up for discussion, and thank you for raising that. So it's the top of the hour. Thank you, Miss Steve. It's the first time I see you here. So we'll close this session. Yeah.